Frederick Douglass is dead. And might very well remain that way, despite the best attempts of our present overlord to resurrect him without a single living black mother's permission. If he should come and be recognized as anything other than the muted whisper of a body interred, I wish his return as some strange and ungovernable terror, a ghost story turned live in direct ectoplasm without warning. Frederick in the White House kitchens, Frederick in the faucets, Frederick posted up at every corner of the Oval Office, shredding documents invisibly, a blade in each of his 18 laser hands. "Go off," his more radical undead colleagues will exclaim. "You better tell that man to keep your name out his mouth." But Frederick Douglass doesn't say a thing. Not yet. "He's waiting for you and me," my grandmother says. Frederick Douglass is irrevocably dead and refuses to ride until we are ready, until our prayers are knives or sheets of flame. Hear us, O beloved, fugitive saint. Defer the rain. Grant us the strength of a rage we can barely fathom. Make us brave as the flock in the fist of a storm. Unmoor every melody they built from our screams. Steady our dreams. Keep us warm.
You are listening to the Norton Library Podcast, where we explore classic works of literature and philosophy with the leading scholars of the Norton Library, a new series from W.W. Norton that introduces influential texts to a new generation of readers. I'm your host, Mark Chirino, with Michael Von Cannon producing. Today we present the second of our 2 episodes devoted to the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, as we speak with its editor, Joshua Bennett. We just heard Joshua reading Frederick Douglass is Dead from his 2020 poetry collection, Ode, excerpted courtesy of Penguin Random House Audio. In the first episode, we discussed Douglass's life and times, the structure of the narrative, along with some of the famous episodes from Douglass's autobiography. In this second episode, we will learn more about Joshua Bennett's response to the narrative, the music this text inspires, his favorite line from the book, and much more. Joshua Bennett is a professor of literature at MIT. He is the author of 5 books of poetry, criticism, and narrative nonfiction, including The Sobbing School and Being Property Once Myself. Joshua Bennett, welcome back to the Norton Library Podcast.
Mark, thanks so much for having me.
I'm looking forward to probing more about your wonderful edition of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And I want to start with the striking book cover. Is there a reason why the geniuses at the Norton Library created this scheme for the cover?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, because originally it was a different color. It was just gold and blue, which would have been nice. I would appreciate that. But they did talk about the green, I think, kind of popping off the shelf. I also like to think it's because the kind of ecological vision of Frederick Douglass was a big part of what I emphasized in the book. And so that growing, glowing greenness, I think, is part of what they wanted to reflect on this cover.
So we have green, gold, and a really deep blue.
Like the ocean. Yeah.
The ocean. There you go. Okay. So there's always a reason. What I've learned is there's always a reason. It doesn't just have to be attractive. There has to also be something behind it. Okay. So that's really good. Joshua, do you remember the first time you ever read this book?
Oh, yeah. So I was a junior in high school, in AP English. And I remember, and I feel kind of bad, like revisiting the book now, because I worry people will think I'm trying to roast my teacher. But I wasn't. I mean, he really did outline something that was curious, and it was what was on his mind at the time. Now that I lecture more, I understand it. But he said, I don't understand why I have to teach this to you for the AP. This is history, not literature. And that was on my mind the entire time I was working on this introduction and revisiting the book. Also because one of the editorial comments I got back while working on it was that I should really clarify, especially because we have a high school readership, that Douglass didn't quote unquote, make it up, right? Because there's a portion of the intro where I talk about him trying to craft his own origin myth, which obviously he was doing, right? Which any of us are doing who engage in an act of memoir autobiography, right? We're life writing, we're self writing. And I just thought that was so curious, right? This idea that facticity, right? Or the creation of a historical document necessarily is, kind of oppositional to the usage of trope, right? Or of organizing the elements a certain way to tell the kind of story you're trying to tell. Like, yeah, it's all true. These things happened, right? He even acknowledges the gaps, right? Where he says he doesn't know when his birthday is. I mean, he actually does, I think, a great job of that. And so the first time I read it was my junior year of high school, but it stuck with me for many years.
Don't you think you could study this book in a history class one way and then in a literature class a different way?
Oh, for sure. You could study in a theory class on, autoethnography. I mean, there's a lot that you could do with this book because, again, he gives you a kind of affective portrait. It's one thing to know the dates and names and times. It's another to hear Frederick Douglass describe how it felt to be sold alongside sheep and oxen and his family members, right? It's a kind of granular description that's really important. And that, to my mind is inseparable from any history worth its salt. Now, on the literature side, I mean, this is what I do, right? It's really important that, we study again at a kind of formal level. What are the different sort of tropes and techniques Douglass is using to achieve that effect? Right? Why are we drawn to certain passages? Even just having one of the chapters be just much longer than all the others, right? The penultimate chapter is just much longer than the rest of them. I mean, it really does give you this sense of rising action. And like he says, you'll see how a man was made into a brute. Now you'll see, how a brute was made into a man. Like that kind of beautiful, rhetorical flourish, that chiasmatic flip, I think is really, kind of crucial. So yeah, you could teach it in history and in literature. It's a book for everyone.
Do you think there are challenges that are common to reading this book?
Yes. The brutality, to be honest. I mean, having revisited and even really thinking about the ages, right? Because Aunt Hester's a teenager, right? In the beginning of this book. So there's also something too to thinking about him as a little boy in that first chapter, experiencing those scenes that he's quite young. For most of the book. I mean, he's quite young when it's published, right? He's in his 20s, late 20s, right? I believe 27 years old, right, when the book comes out. And so that for me is actually the real difficulty, returning to it in a way, all these years later to kind of revisit it before our conversation. I was just thinking about how young he was, the graphic nature of many of the scenes, the sexual violence of the text. And, even if I'm honest, sometimes the kind of grace and mercy he shows, to the people who were his captors. Right? I mean, Douglass really did have this remarkable capacity that, part of me admires, but I don't really totally get it. Part of me admires it, part of me really doesn't like it. Where he just makes so much room for the humanity of these people that he really does seem to believe have been hypnotized by this brutal spiritual force. Right? This like spiritual and material force that has taken a hold of them and convinced them that they are in the right, that they have somehow not committed this grave evil against humanity and against their God. So I think that is very difficult to read and to be a kind of immediate audience for. It's all working together, I think, to make the book what it is. And it's part of why it's timeless.
Would you say that Douglass as a stylist is challenging? Is he, you mentioned in the first episode that he's allusive to the Bible and other texts. Is that a challenge for students, or do they find his writing pretty straightforward?
I mean, they have some endnotes to help in most of the editions you'll pick up. So I think that's good and important. You'll learn what endnotes are if you don't know, right? But I also just think, and I mentioned Morrison in the first episode too, Toni Morrison. But I love that she also says this about Beloved. So now we get 2 Morrison mentions, 2 Beloved mentions. But when she's on Oprah talking about it, and Oprah kind of says, to paraphrase, it's a difficult read. You have to read it a couple of times. And then Morrison just says, well, that's what I call reading. So there's also a way that in kind of thinking through the subterranean layers of Douglass's prose, I think he's teaching us how to read in a book that is in many ways about learning how to read and teaching others how to read. He's doing the thing itself, even in the way the text is structured. But No, I mean, the times I've taught it or read it, even in groups, I mean, there's a kind of lyrical sensibility to it. There's a musicality to it. You can tell that he's a great orator, right? I mean, it's almost written to be read aloud in certain senses. And where it does get a bit dense, it's because you need to be rooted in the details. He really is trying to paint a picture for you, which, for Douglas, I mean, that's kind of the height of eloquence, right? He regards poets as picture makers. He'll say this, over 30 years after the book is published, when he's, kind of trying to think about photography and the art of photography. He says, well, the great preachers, the great poets, they are picture makers of a certain kind. If you hear a great speech, you see the imagery in your mind. And that's important as a kind of democratic process, right? That there are certain people who can analyze a kind of dense argument, but the masses, we need pictures, to be motivated, he says.
Joshua, let me ask you an unfair question, and that is, do you have a favorite line in this book?
Oh my goodness. Do I have a favorite line in this book? I mean, I have so many. Let me see. I underlined so much of that. Oh, this is it. Chapter 7. So he's talking about, basically when he's thinking about Sheridan's speeches, right? It's 2 sentences. Does that count as a line? Okay. It's 3 sentences.
That's allowed. No, 3 is allowed.
Okay. These were choice documents to me. I read them over and over again with unabated interest. They gave tongue to interesting thoughts of my own soul, which had frequently flashed through my mind and died away for want of utterance. Right? I mean, look, for those of us who teach literature, it's like, oh yeah, that's it. Right? You want a case for the humanities. That's it. It will give fuller expression for the things inside you that die away for want of utterance. You need other people's words to find your own words. Eloquence does not spring up out of the ground. If you want to be a good writer, you want to be a good speaker, you have to read. It's just where it comes from. And I love that he says that. And I'm even interested in the fact that it's followed by a kind of sadness, right? Because he said, and I touched on this a bit in the first episode, but he's like, man, I didn't even know I felt some of that stuff. But now that I've read more, I have language for my despair. And so I also have to come up against that and work these things out in the forge of my own heart, right? So reading is not just about being teleported elsewhere. It's not just about pleasure or, oh, I really like this. I read about the things I like. It's about the great difficulty of the soul and having more instruments ready at hand to encounter it, to encounter your own pain, to encounter your own past. Yeah. So I was very moved by that.
That's a great sequence where it's almost like his reading has increased his sensitivity, expanded his consciousness. And it's so sad that he would say, if I were as insensate as a rock, then I wouldn't feel pain. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but wow, what a powerful moment that is. And I love the plug for the humanities too.
It's crucial. And what wisdom though, right? Too. Cause there's something to it, right? It's like, look, if I wasn't paying attention to anything, I might get along a bit better. It might be easier to move through the day.
And then by implication, the vast majority of his fellow enslaved people would not have that power of literacy. And so he's sort of looking at it in different levels.
Well, he's saying this is part of what's been kept from us, right? That this is our great inheritance. I think also even in alluding to something like the sorrow songs, I mean, he's also tipping his hat, I think, to other people who were enslaved, right? He's saying, look at what we have created. Literacy is punishable by death, right? By dismemberment or death, right? And yet we have still created what will eventually, it becomes the foundation for gospel, the blues, right? Some would say, soul and hip hop, right? I mean, it's remarkable what they're able to create. And through the image again of the Sabbath school, which I think becomes symbolic in so many ways, but you can almost see it, that it passes from person to person, that kind of sensitivity that you're describing, right? That literary sensibility, which is also sensitivity. And it makes it such that there are some, right? Like Henry, I believe, who's just not afraid of death in the same way, right? He's just like, you got to kill me, right? I have to be free now. I just know too much. I know too much. I'm not going back. You'll have to kill me, and I'm not as afraid of it.
Joshua, I'm wondering if you have devices or favorite practices that you use for teaching this book or would recommend to other teachers of this?
Yeah, it's been a while, but honestly, I think one way to teach the book is to teach it alongside his speeches, right? So part of what I really love about Douglass is that he has these kind of bright lines that he carries through his career around literacy, around technological progress, which is super interesting, right? A commitment to nature, but also so you can see the way that some of the details change over time, right? When you learn, for example, that I think it's like years into the future where he eventually kind of forgives Ald, for example, right? And this essay, I think it's called Time Makes All Things Even, right? And Thomas Ald is like 80 years old at that point. And he essentially says, one, that he found out that he was a year younger than he thought he was, right? From Ald, but also that he kind of like forgives this guy in a way. Like there's just really interesting things that happen when you read like portions from the later autobiographies as well as the speeches alongside this narrative. So you can see where he eventually fills in the gaps, but also this remarkable thematic consistency through his life. So that's something I would recommend. Just sort of go chapter by chapter, think of them all as themed chapters, and then you can explore, right? Thinking about kind of slavery and brutality, thinking about, his kind of theory of labor and value that you see when he like works on the docks, the chapters that really emphasize, gardening. I mean, there's just a lot of really interesting things happening thematically. So that's one way I would teach it, because it gives the students a kind of gem to latch onto, as they're kind of mapping out Douglass's argument across the book.
That's excellent. And like you're reading the book and chapter 2 is about those sorrow songs.
Yes.
And it's almost kind of unexpected that in an autobiography of somebody like Frederick Douglass, that's where he would put so much focus on at such an early time. So what do you think we could do with that? Why does that play such a prominent role?
Well, he's a lover of art, right? And he'll be a lover of art, lover of Shakespeare, right? Lover of poetry for his entire life. I mean, it's also in that chapter where he outlines some of the other material conditions on the plantation, like the exposure of the enslaved to cold, for instance, right? He talks about them all kind of sleeping on the floor. He talks about himself sleeping in kind of a sack with his feet exposed, and how eventually you could put a pen in the cracks in his feet. I mean, just this kind of brutal imagery. And he says seemingly, right, that the sorrow songs emerge from that, right? That this is the artistic expression of, what Ellison will eventually, he'll describe the blues as kind of like personal catastrophe made lyrical. Right. And Douglass seems to say this is that for the enslaved, like the sorrow songs emerge from this. So I think that's part of what he's doing, right? He's saying it's not just kind of social death in some flat sense. Like there are these signs of life. There are these glimmers of, not just hope, but again, a kind of blueness, right? It's almost this in-between space between a kind of hope and despair that the enslaved are not only able to imagine for themselves, but to turn into music, to turn into these kind of fugitive practices like schools they create, preaching, forms of literature that emerge out of it.
We ask our guests who come on the Norton Library podcast for a hot take or a counterintuitive reading. Is there something you find yourself thinking about this book that is contrary to what you hear most other interpretations?
No, that's fantastic. I don't know if this is so much a hot take, and I do outline it in the intro. It really is the breadth of the ecology stuff, right? So even with him being kind of dragged through the woods by oxen, beginning with those horses, coming back to horses and other forms of animal life in his later speeches, it is shocking to me that we don't talk about Frederick Douglass more in kind of animal rights discourse, or think of him as a kind of eco-critic. Like it's clearly a major part of this. Even the elements of conjure, right? The idea that like with certain kinds of leaves that he can create spells and change, material reality, bend the laws of nature, another rhetorical device, the adenaton, right? I mean, there's something there that I think is quite powerful. And it wasn't something I was super familiar with. Even when I was writing my dissertation, there wasn't a ton out there about thinking about Douglass as a kind of eco-critic, and certainly not thinking about Douglass as, one of our first kind of robust theorists of the connections between human and animal life,
right? And from multiple vantages, right? Because he asserts that he is not an animal distinctly, right? He does like kind of mark out that line, but he also says that animals are not what we think they are, right? That animals have an opacity to them. They have an interior life, and that he knows that because he lived and labored alongside the animals. So I actually think you miss something tremendous if when you see the gardens in this book, where you see his interactions with animals, where you see the way he talks about water, if you're not thinking about the kind of ecological metaphors as central, you're kind of missing, I think, what he's up to and what he's trying to convey to us.
Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, the first point he makes in his entire narrative is that how he's treated because of the lack of knowledge of the birth date and his family, which is what a wonderful connection. So since this book was published, has it been repurposed or presented in a different way in any other form that we can appreciate or that might allow us to learn more about Douglas and his narrative?
Yeah, I mean, there are like operas, so something I've been really interested in for a while. Yeah. Based on kind of the life and times of Frederick Douglass. And so part of what I've been thinking about, I mean that literally, by the way, not as just like the title of the book, the actual life and times of Frederick Douglass. But part of what I've been trying to think about too, and there's a bit of this in the introduction, are the ways that poets and poets, I mean, across, I'm thinking about MCs too. I think of hip hop as poetry. Maybe we can save that for another podcast, but I'm interested in how groups like the Fugees, contemporary hip hop artists like Denzel Curry, and even, earlier 20th century poets like Robert Hayden kind of repurposed the central themes of narrative of the life to describe their own relationship to writing. As such, appetite to write like Frederick Douglass with the slave hand. I mean, the idea that writing can become a kind of portal of entry into a deeper sense of human becoming. I mean, that's something that you see people picking up almost 200 years later from this book. And so that's one of the ways you can see its kind of reverberations out into the world.
In our first episode, you said that Douglas consciously constructed this as a hero's journey, but I'm not sure there's been a movie. Seems like it would be given to a nice, incredibly powerful film.
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to see I think the pitch for it would be super interesting, right? I mean, you can kind of see the 3-act structure of it. I mean, the scenes, I mean, they're all there. And I mean, he's made appearances in movies like Lincoln, right? But I mean, we've seen Douglas on screen, but never as the kind of central figure, not the protagonist. At least the limited series, I think, would be super cool. And also his novella, The Heroic Slave, I think would look really interesting on screen as well.
We've talked about music on both of these episodes. Do you have a Frederick Douglass playlist that you could recommend?
I don't. I can put something together though.
What do you think?
In my mind, it would have a lot of jazz on it. Like Kamasi Washington would be on there. You'd have to have, Nas, one mic thing. Like all I need is one mic, right? All I need is kind of this singular opportunity to put it all together and craft something wonderful. Stevie Wonder, for once in my life, I guess I'm thinking about too. Like that, the fact that the narrative ends in marriage, I think is interesting and important. Like love is central for Douglas, becomes a father and grandfather, and sometimes his grandchildren would gather around him to hear him play the violin, which is, I think, a beautiful image. It's one of my favorite images in the introduction. Who else would be in there? Yeah, give me a beat. I'll come back with everything is everything. Lauryn Hill. I mean, there's so much that I would put on there because the core ethos of the thing is a love of freedom, the pursuit of it, and the fact that it's not a straight line. Right? Like Douglas's journey kind of dips and curves, right? He hatches this elaborate plot. He's betrayed. He does eventually get free, but we don't quite know how. And so there are all these apertures and absences that I think also really make the book come to life. And there are so many moments again where he's utterly downtrodden, right? He just sort of says it. He like in that moment, I just thought I'm going to give up, right? And then there were others yet and still where he said, I resolved that day that I would be free. And it took years. It's not that he resolved that day. I mean, this is part of how we know that this is a man located in history, right? He resolves that day, but it takes years, right? It takes many attempts. It takes a kind of internal revolution before he can be freed, before he can help set himself free, right? So yeah, the playlist would definitely orbit, I think, around that kind of dream of freedom and the people who make it possible for us.
One more question about the music, because when we had Jesse McCarthy on to talk about the Souls of Black Folk, his Norton Library edition, in the beginning of each chapter of the Souls of Black Folk, there is right there, there's the sheet music and there's the spiritual to which it is associated. So do you see a line throughout, well, let's say throughout African American literature of W.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, and that chapter 2 in the narrative kind of is almost its genesis point of how he's articulating what the importance was?
Yeah, I mean, Baldwin will take this up later, right? But the critique of chapter 2 is you all don't know how to hear the music properly. Right. He says that, you know, a kind of predominantly white audience, they see the songs as a sign. Well, these people are content. Look how happy they are. They're singing. And he's like, it's because you don't understand the music. And if you did, you would understand the deep sorrow. That's its condition of possibility and emergence. Right. So I think, yeah, it's absolutely crucial and key. The music is always there. You know, one of the great, perhaps the greatest African-American novel ever written, you know, is Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. How does that begin? With a man underground, you know, playing jazz, stealing power from a city, talking about the music that's made from being invisible. I mean, you can't get around the music, you know, and thank goodness for that, right? Like that, it's crucial, right? It doesn't really swing. And this is me as a poet, like with poet sensibility, there are parts of this that you could read out loud and they still totally swing. And that's part of the point, right? That when you read something out loud, it becomes a social occasion. Right. When Langston Hughes talked about writing poetry, he said he wanted to write like the songs they sang on 7th Street. Right. Which one I think just sounds beautiful. You read it aloud. It's alliterative, you know, but I think he means it. I think that when Sylvia Wynter says that, you know, her aim was to write theory, that read the way Aretha Franklin sang. I mean, so many of us, if you've been around great musicians, you know, music, the art aspires toward it. Right. So I think Douglas understood that.
Your interest in pretending, it seems like the sorrow songs feed into that, where they're singing it in one mode, which is the depths of sorrow, and we're all hearing it, or the overseers and owners were hearing it as a sign, as an expression of pleasure. How unhappy could they be? They're singing. So they're sort of wearing the mask even in chapter 2 of the narrative.
Yeah, there's that Dunbar in there. We'll be reading Dunbar for sure. But yeah, I mean, I guess I'm also interested in all of these fugitive lyric moments. So Wade in the Water, for instance, right? Which sounds like it's a hymn about baptism, which of course it is, but it's also about getting your scent off, you know, so the bloodhounds can't capture you. You know, Follow the Drinking Gourd is at once about, you know, a constellation, but also mapping a pathway north to freedom. This idea of a kind of doubleness, right? Like it's Du Bois's double consciousness, but how that lends itself to a poetics, right? So when Dunbar talks about us wearing the mask that grins and lies, the art isn't outside of that, right? Like the art is talking out of both sides of its mouth in a really powerful way, right? There's one mind for us, another for the master, fugitivity, masking, even something like the pit school. I don't know if you're familiar with this term, right? But during chattel slavery, there were these schools, again, that people would create out of holes in the ground. Like enslaved people would literally dig holes in the ground, jump into those pits and teach one another to read and write via candlelight, right? This is narrated in books like Night John, Light in the Dark. You know, in children's literature, you see this kind of narrated quite beautifully. And also in the Federal Writers Project interviews. And I'm just fascinated by that, right? That, you know, Black education, Black literature, Black music is an underground affair.
When you're saying about Dunbar, Paul Laurence Dunbar, who wrote the poem, We Wear the Mask, and we wear the mask that grins and lies, how does that factor in to Douglas's behavior? Does he grin and lie, both in his writing of the book and his behavior when he was enslaved? or is he defiant?
You're helping me switch up my answer with that last word. I think the defiance is made manifest through the performance of pretending, right? And so, I mean, he pretends simply in that he doesn't let anyone know he knows how to read, right? He hides it. The students of his Sabbath school hide it by necessity, right? So this act of pretending, of disguising reality, of wearing a mask, that is resistance. It's a resistance in a world that's designed to crush you. And the other thing I think is that pretending is self-preservation, right? He pretends to keep himself literally biologically alive, but also because it's for him, right? It's this kind of treasure that he has stored up within himself that he's helping to cultivate in others. And so part of the defiance of the text, it's made manifest in the historical truth of those parts of the narrative. But even, this other point that we touched on already, that he doesn't give us everything. He says, there's a certain manner through which I escaped that I must withhold because the cause of freedom is more important than this being a bestseller or with me completely, being forthcoming with you, right? You don't need that, right? What you need is the truth that I've offered, which is a beautiful moral truth and a historical truth, all kind of bound up together. So yeah, I think the defiance comes through the act of subterfuge, through maintaining our opacity and us saying like glissant that we have a right to it.
There's a power in that reserve that he's keeping in the narrative of this book. That's fantastic. Joshua, the last question that I would love for you to comment on is, so reading this narrative in 2024 is a particular set of circumstance. And I wonder if you could reflect on where we are as a society and how today's readers approach this book and what it might mean for us particularly, as opposed to, let's say, when the book first came out or 100 years ago.
Here's actually the main thing I want us to take away. Douglas's persistence as an actual flesh and blood person is a miracle. It's a miracle that he survived what he survived and that he lent his hand to the labor of writing these books. We should not forget that. We should also forget that it's not that long ago that this happened, right? That the events of this book took place. So I think as we're thinking now about the structure of our society, the structure of the workplace, the structure of our schools and universities, we need to keep in mind that this infrastructure was built by people like Douglas. It was built by enslaved people, any number of whom were as brilliant as Frederick Douglass. People who labored and died and are in unmarked graves will never know their names. Like, we have his book as a kind of artifact, but in many ways too, it's this kind of deeply sorrowful echo of the potential that all of those many millions held, right? As Baldwin and others would phrase it, the many thousands gone, right? Douglas, I think his narrative calls us to remember them and to think about them and to think about their potential, to think about the potential of people now who are from historically marginalized communities, who may never have access to the forms of education, and literature and teaching, that helped make stories like Douglas's possible. I mean, his emphasis on education, he comes back to it over and over again. He says, this helped open my mind and open my life, was reading. I saw an article headline the other day about whether or not, AI was heralding the end of reading, which I think that's overblown.
Oh, heavens.
But I also think, Douglas reminds us of why reading is so crucial. It's not just a way to pass the time. It's a way to cultivate the self. And that's utterly necessary.
Joshua Bennett, thank you so much for joining us on the Norton Library Podcast.
Of course. Thanks for the invitation and for the conversation.
The Norton Library edition of Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, edited by Joshua Bennett, is available now in paperback and ebook. Check out the links in the description to this episode for ordering options and more information about the Norton Library, including the full catalog of titles.